Thank you very much, Tom. So, good evening to everyone, and welcome to, well, first, my name is Pedro Raca. I'm professor of economics at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte. And on behalf of the San Diego chapter of the Fulbright Association, I am pleased to welcome you to this webinar titled 2020 Vision of U.S.-Mexico Border, Frontline Perspectives from Journalists and Researchers. So the event will be a virtual roundtable discussion on contemporary border issues featuring acclaimed Mexican and U.S. border journalists and scholars. The San Diego chapter of the Fulbright Association is pleased to sponsor this timely panel of distinguished journalists and scholars who will increase our understanding of pressing U.S.-Mexico border issues. The event is part of our effort to make our chapter a true cross-border resource that reflects the border's importance and the broader region's profound interdependence. Right? So as I just mentioned, we have two acclaimed journalists, two acclaimed scholars, and we will cover different topics such as the consequences of anti-immigrant rhetoric along the border, the health consequences of pandemic mitigation in border areas, the rhetoric of free trade and protectionism versus border realities, and the threats to press freedom from cartels and beyond. Before we introduce our panelists, I'm going to explain the dynamic of the event to the audience. So the idea is that each panelist will talk for approximately 10 minutes. And after that, there will be a discussion with our panelists where they can answer questions from the audience, from other panelists, or from the moderators. So I will first introduce our panelists based in Mexico. I start with Dr. Yetta Bojorquez. She's an epidemiologist and a public health specialist. She previously worked as a deputy director at Mexico's Ministry of Health. Since 2010, she has been a professor at the Department of Population Studies at El Colegio de la Frontera Norte. And her research focuses on the social determinants of health, mental health, health-related practices, and migrant health. And among her current projects, she's working on the prevalence and factors associated with COVID-19 infection, HIV, and latent tuberculosis among migrants in Tijuana. So welcome, Yetza. Thank you for being here. Our other panelist based in Mexico is the journalist Vicente Calderon. He's a distinguished journalist with more than 30 years of experience focusing on issues on both sides of the US-Mexico border. Vicente has a unique perspective on the dynamic and complex border region. He started working in radio in Tijuana, has accumulated experience and knowledge in Los Angeles as a TV news anchor, as well as in San Diego and Tijuana, first as a reporter, and today as editor of Tijuana's first online news site, tijuanapress.com. He has developed news in English and Spanish, producing for CBS News, Al Jazeera America, among others. And he helped launch Newsweek en Español Baja California as editorial coordinator. He's a graduate of the School of Clinical Psychology of CETIS Universidad. So welcome, Vicente. So now to introduce our two US-based panelists, I give the floor to Dr. Tom Pasananti. Tom is the main organizer of the event and the co-moderator. And I want to take the opportunity to congratulate him for putting together such an interesting panel of experts.
Oh, thank you, Pedro. I want to congratulate myself for having such a great co-organizer as you, Pedro. It's been a pleasure working with you. Very modest and super helpful, and we've carried the load equally. I'm going to be a little more brief because I botched the beginning, but you please see the notes to the program if you want to find out more about the two distinguished U.S. panelists today. First, let me say that I am thrilled to introduce my friend and colleague at San Diego State, James Gerber, who has recently retired after a career of over 35 years. He's published widely, 3 big books, one a textbook on international finance, a recent one from Cambridge University Press on the history of financial crises. And more to the point for this panel, he is the author of a highly acclaimed economic history of the border states on both sides of the border. So welcome, Jim. And last but certainly not least, I want to introduce another friend of mine, Alfredo Corchado. And in memory of RBG, I want to paraphrase one of her dinner questions when she, as a way to introduce Alfredo. RBG would often ask her guests, what is the difference? Well, I'm paraphrasing. So what is the difference between a migrant field hand in California's Central Valley and a best-selling author who's also an award-winning international journalist? The answer, 1 generation. Alfredo Corchado is the son of a Bracero family and has published 2 terrific books, Midnight in Mexico and more recently Homelands. He's been a longtime reporter at the Dallas Morning News. And without further ado, I'd like to kick off this panel by having Alfredo take the word. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for that kind introduction. And hello to everyone. I know some of you. Vicente, my colleague, I just found out has been doing this for over 50 years. That's quite amazing. I thought I'm not a doctor, I'm not a professor, but maybe speak to you as a reporter who, I normally cover the U.S.-Mexico border. I'm based in Mexico City, but since March, I've been in El Paso, and my focus has really been up and down the border, Ciudad Juarez, not doing much traveling other than getting by in vehicles. And in fact, the paper has tried to minimize our traveling into Juarez, although as a long-time foreign correspondent, I don't always listen to the advice. But I just thought maybe I speak about 3 stories that I've covered since March. And I know that the time is limited, so real quick, we're just coming a month after the first anniversary of the massacre in El Paso at the El Paso Walmart. And this is, it's a killing that really strikes at everything that's been happening on the border, whether it's immigration, whether it's the wall, it's the fear of others. What you need to know is that this is a young person, 21-year-old from Dallas, who drove 650 miles, 10 hours to El Paso and came to, in his words, kill Mexicans, stop the Hispanic invasion of Texas. We spent a year as reporters at the Morning News looking into what motivated this person to do this. He said in his, he actually sent a manifesto like 2 minutes before the killings and put it online and said, this is what I'm gonna do. And one line he said was, this is not because of President Trump. But if you look at the language, if you talk to the victims, if you talk to relatives of the victims, they all point to the president's inflammatory language and the talk about an invasion, the talk about a wall. It's interesting to know that 1 week before this killing, there was a big private effort, a GoFundMe account, to try to raise money for a private wall. I mean, I can actually see it from here. But they raised $25 million. It went all over YouTube. And some of the sources I've been talking to said, you know, issues like that led him to believe that there is an invasion. I mean, if you cover Mexico, if you cover the Southwest, killing Mexicans is not uncommon. I mean, it's happened throughout the history of both countries, but this is a modern day massacre where 23 people were killed. Most of them were U.S. citizens, but there was at least 8 who were Mexican. People who came across that morning they enter the country legally to shop. So as a result of that, we've been following the case, but also looking at what's happened on the border because of that killing and also because of the pandemic. I mean, we've seen, for example, how shelters across in Mexico that were taking migrants, I mean, have basically been emptied out in the last few months because many of the migrants themselves don't feel safe. Many of them are, I mean, asylum is virtually ended. There's no asylum, there's no immigration process to even try to bring a case. I was on the border last week and I was stunned by an INS bus, an ICE bus, I'm sorry. An ICE bus showed up with about 150 migrants and just basically deported into Mexico. Did a lot of interviews with many of them who said, we were in detention centers. One person was in Utah for 10 days. Then he was transferred to Nevada on a plane. They picked up more migrants. They ended up in Seattle, Washington, and finally in El Paso. And along the way, this person was never tested for COVID. And he crosses into Ciudad Juarez on the eve of the Mexican independence, not knowing whether he had COVID, whether he was spreading it to his family, going back to a country that he had not lived in for 28 years. And there were many similar stories along the way. I mean, similar examples of that. Today, we just followed a story on 6 months after the pandemic, the impact on the U.S.-Mexico border, but the impact more specifically in Ciudad Juarez and El Paso. El Paso so far has lost more than $100 million in retail sales because it's very uneven measures. Americans can still go back and forth, as you all know, but the Mexicans, it's all these incredible restrictions. So as a result, you see a lot of stores on the El Paso side, right along the border, that are just begin to shut down. And I mean, there's no expectation that this thing will end at least through November, maybe December, and so forth. So there is concern as to what happens to many of these people. Many people who work in the United States as gardeners, as maids, construction, who have been stuck in Juarez. They're not really working in the maquilas. So there is a concern about the social pressure that you're seeing in Mexico with migrants who either stay, as I said, not many of them are staying in shelters, but many are living in Ciudad Juarez. I'll leave you one last interesting story. The migrants from Cuba, for example, and from Venezuela are now rebuilding parts of Ciudad Juarez that was very hard hit by the narco wars, by the drug war. These are neighborhoods where people were too afraid to invest. And so all of a sudden you see like a roll of little La Habana, a lot of pizzerias, a lot of cafeterias. And that's something that, it's fascinating to watch because again, you're living through a pandemic, but yet there's the sense of resiliency that continues to thrive. So I'll leave it at that, and then before you cut me off, Tom.
Thank you very much, Alfredo. You had another 15 seconds.
Okay. I was counting them.
All right. I believe next we're going to go across the border to Dr. Borges. Yes?
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Well, I'm very happy to be here because it's not every day that I have the opportunity to share a panel with such a diverse group of people. I mean, this is really, really interesting for me. Thank you. And well, as I said, my focus on research is about migration and health mainly. So when I was trying to think what makes the border special besides migration or beyond migration, I was thinking of the border as an asset. That's what really struck me the first time I came here I'm originally from Mexico City. And how, for those who are able to cross, of course, the border opens a whole world of opportunities in very different areas. And I think one of those areas is precisely health related and health services. So that's the first thing I want to talk about, like the good side of the border, when you can access services and goods that you can't access in other parts of the countries, of both countries. So many of you probably are familiar with people going across the border to seek healthcare on the other side. And mainly this movement happens from the United States to Mexico, to the Mexican side of the border, because of one, the lower prices of services and of drugs and of every medications and surgery, etc. But it also can happen because of cultural reasons, because people mainly of Mexican origin, or maybe Latino in general, feel more comfortable with doctors and nurses and dentists that can speak in Spanish and that are more relatable in terms of the culture. So I think there's this very interesting exchange between the health services in the Mexican side of the border and patients or people coming to seek care from the US side. The other thing that is, of course, a big factor driving this movement is that some drugs and some treatments that are not available in the US are available in Mexico. So even a few years ago, antibiotics were available for purchase without a prescription in Mexico. That changed a few years ago, but still there are some drugs and medications that you can get in Mexico without a prescription that probably in the US will be more difficult to find. And also because of the different sanitary restrictions and regulations, some treatments can be accessible for people coming across the border in Mexico that are not available in the US, which is a good thing and not always a good thing. It also can happen that some of those treatments aren't really very scientifically sound, but it's still a motor of the movement of transborder health service utilization. And the movement from the Mexican side to the US side, of course, is much more limited because the prices in the US are totally crazy. I mean, you can't access healthcare in the US if you don't have insurance. But at the same time, you have a not small population of people living in the Mexican side of the border, but working or for other reasons having insurance in the US that also can go across the border to seek care in the US. And that was very, very visible during the COVID. Well, it's still visible now, but mainly in the past few months, during the first months of the COVID pandemic, as people went across the border to seek care in the US when the Mexican hospitals were already filled with patients and they couldn't take more patients, or because they, I don't know, trusted more the services in the other side of the border, etc. So healthcare services in the US side of the border, close to the border, were also filled with people coming from the Mexican side who were not necessarily Mexican nationals, but were living in Mexico and usually wouldn't cross for some treatments and started crossing at that point. No? So this very strong interconnection in the using of health services is important for many reasons. It's important because of as I said, regulatory reasons and the quality of care, the protocols of care, the types of medications and of other things you can get on each side are different. So in as much as they are not harmonized, a person can receive a treatment that is very different in one side and the other, and that can lead to interruptions on healthcare, in the continuity of care, which at the same time are part of the ability of the person to make decisions about his or her own health, which is an interesting thing. But from the point of view of the health system, can be not very efficient and probably not very, not conducive to good quality of care in some cases. But it's a very complicated issue and a very interesting one that also has consequences in the economy in both sides of the border and in the social relationships in both sides of the border. Medical tourism in places like Tijuana, Ciudad Juárez, Mexicali, and others have it's a very important industry for these cities, and it also branches out in other types of services that are related, as in the hotels that care for people coming for medical procedures in Mexico, etc. So it's a huge thing, I think, in the border. Now, a second thing that is special in this area is that there's also the possibility of people crossing the border to provide care in the other side, mainly again from the US to Mexico. And this is the case of the many groups or individual volunteers that have been providing care to migrants at the Mexican side of the border. But there are other groups also providing care, especially to the less advantaged people in the Mexican side. And then we have exchanges of medical students, for example, or nurse students or other types of health professionals, psychologists, etc., which are also, as in the case I was talking about, an important asset, an important source of care that is at the same time not very much regulated, not very much efficient, and I feel there's so much room for improvement, again, from the point of view of the health system as a whole. But it's also something that is happening because it is organic. I mean, people is not going to stop seeking care. People is not going to stop offering care. No? So how you combine this autonomy of people in their ability to seek care and offer care with the need for some kind of regulation by the state authority, it's I think a very interesting research subject for me personally, but also a very interesting public policy issue. No? How you manage to regulate all of this, to harmonize all of this. Another issue that I see as an asset in a sense is the Mexican care workers that go across the border to provide care in the US. But legally or not so legally, but there are many Mexican health professionals providing care in the US side in a capacity that is below their training, actually being functioning mainly as carers of, for example, elderly people or chronically ill patients, and they are providing this care in many senses that their professional background allows them to provide in a more professionalized way. But at the same time, it has to do with all this interplay between carer and the people who receive the care that goes beyond the technical and into the realm of the emotional. So care work is very interesting also, and it's another feature of border life or transborder health service exchange or utilization that I think it's very interesting in the region. Now, migration is of course a salient issue in the region, and Vicente already talked about the situation of those migrants that are getting spending time basically stranded at the southern side of the border.
Sorry, it's 1 minute, please.
Oh, okay. So of course, this is a population with all sorts of pressing health issues, but I think there are some health issues of this population that are not usually taken into account because we are more thinking more in terms of infectious diseases mainly, and especially in the current situation of the pandemic. But these groups of people also have needs that have to do with, for example, maternal or reproductive health, chronic health issues, and mental health. I think that's a very big issue. So maybe if we think in the emergent situation that we should be thinking about, this will be one, how to provide care to people who is living in a in-between state because they are not ready to establish in Mexico, but they are still wanting to cross to the US, but we don't know what will happen. And how to finance that care, how to, all the aspects of providing that care. So, okay, so those were my main points, and thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much. Super interesting. I think we were going to go to Vicente next. Yes?
Let me put my timer here just to not go for more than the 10 minutes. And first, thank you for the invitation, and please apologize. I apologize for my terrible English. So please be patient. Well, I have to tell you that I'm very excited to be part of this because I'm really sad of the state of life at the border right now. I mean, it's as a border being as a person born in Tijuana and spending most of my time here at the border or connected to the border. I see that we are way back, way behind as we were in the past for many, many reasons. I want to try to focus on the issue that Tom asked me to talk about which is the point of the threats of press freedom. And if we have time, we can talk about other reasons why I'm so sad about the state of the affairs in the border right now, way beyond of the things that Alfredo mentioned with the closing of the border and the unfair restrictions for the border people. But unfortunately, the threats to freedom of the press in Mexico are not new at the border. We actually are in better shape than other areas of the border. We compare with Tamaulipas, for example, or even in the other extremes of the country within Mexico. Veracruz has a terrible situation based on the number of killings of reporters, of journalists, of media workers in general. But you can say the same about people in Guanajuato or in other areas of the country. Unfortunately, right now, we're in a big mess. I do see some signs of hope, but we are in a big mess. And this has been increased in terms of intensity due to the pandemic. The pandemic is showing how fragile we were and the moment where we were experiencing in terms of press freedom, but with more intensity in many ways. And just try to focus on the case of the threats beyond the cartels. We, for example, here in Tijuana, we have to deal with three main organizations that are trafficking along this particular border, the largest metropolitan area along the U.S.-Mexico border. We have with the remnants of the Arellano Felix drug cartel. We still have, as I consider, a big infrastructure can be serving the so-called rivals from Sinaloa or other drug organizations, as they did with Michoacan, for example. But also we have, of course, the prevalence of some groups affiliated to the Sinaloa cartel. And also we have the new player in town in that sense, the Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, which is now what El Chapo was about 10, 12 years ago in Mexico. It's the one with the highest growth rate, so to speak, and the one fighting in all the main plazas. That put many of the journalists who have to deal with these issues in a greater risk. And I want to talk about one particular case which shows that you don't need to be actively investigating drug trafficking or corruption related to drug trafficking. And that is something I prefer to do because I don't want to go against drug traffickers per se, because it's very dangerous and there's no guarantees that you can expect help from anybody here. So 2 years ago, in August of 2017, a reporter in the adjacent town, the city of Rosarito was killed. Luciano Rivera. Luciano Rivera was in a bar hanging out with some friends when a group of people showed up there. And among those guys was somebody who was later identified as a member of the Sinaloa cartel. They have some arguments, some discussions, and they ended up killing Luciano, a young reporter from a local cable station there in Rosarito. According to the police and the investigations, this was not a killing related to his activities as a journalist, but as many other Mexicans, we never know where we're gonna run into somebody dealing with drugs or member of a drug organization or who works for somebody who is dealing with a drug organization. And that means a lot of dangerous lurking around, even if you are not dealing exactly or precisely with this problem of drug trafficking. And unfortunately, apparently so far, we haven't moved ahead with the trial of the people. Let me go back. 1 year later, on the trial, they put three guys on the, 3 guys were arrested. The authorities from the previous state administration was able to arrest 3 members, 2 members of the drug cartel and 1 subject who was part of the group who killed the reporter. Unfortunately, we haven't moved ahead with the trials. I attended like at least 4 or 5 hearings, and they are telling me that those are preliminary hearings. The trial itself hasn't begun. And what I'm trying to get to is that about a couple of months ago, I went to the Attorney General's office here, the one in charge of the investigating the homicide, and I began asking what was the level of the investigators? Have they been able to move forward with that? And they told me, what are you asking? Why do you care? The don't care? I mean, why do you mess with that? Don't you know what's going? You know what's next? You know what's next? You know what happened? But don't you guys think that you are coming out looking very bad because you are just adding to the impunity? Well, things haven't changed. You know how important those guys are? So I never got a response from the local authorities. They just told me to change my subject and they will give me a lot of information and other issues, but not in that one. No? And I took the hint. I haven't decided not to pursue the story, but I have to be very, very careful because the same case that happened to Luciano, which I really believe, unfortunately, he was killed, but not for journalism. He saw some woman who were harassing by this group of fellows, and he intervened. He as a gentleman, he tried to just tell them to stop harassing them, but they didn't. They got mad, and apparently they got a little bit physical when he asked them to stop doing that, and that's why they ended up killing him. The relatives think otherwise. They have some suspicion. So the problem is we don't know, and with this state of affairs, we don't know what's the truth. By this time, many of the witnesses are not there anymore. One of the witnesses made an agreement with the prosecutors, and he was supposed to testify against those other cartel members. We don't know where he is. And even some of my colleagues that promised to be vigilant about the process and the pursuit of justice in that case have forgotten. And I want to say that and make it very clear that many is not that they are not interested, but we go to the other big threat to journalism here and the other big threat of freedom of the press. The reporters have it very difficult to survive as honest reporters in Mexico. The UNESCO was recently naming or numbering some of the threats that we are facing with this pandemic and a pandemic situation, and they say that one of the main problems is the safety of journalism and the lack of jobs and the poor working conditions. And many of the reporters are still willing to try to do good journalism, but the cost is too high and the rewards are very low. I remember when I was working for a local television affiliate to one of the main networks, the time I was just getting my job, they hand me the resignation letter to be signed by me, just when I was beginning. And unfortunately, many of my colleagues, they have to work on those conditions. So it's not just only that it's very dangerous, it's more profitable to be just keeping the old state of affairs, the corruption, the officialist side, so to speak, and you will be more rewarded, because now we have to be looking for a new model on the sustainability of media, which is happening all around the world. But in Mexico, we were always tied to this problem of the advertising from the government to give them this problem that they call soft censorship. But you know what, when it's so highly costly, and we're not talking about money, but with your life, your safety, it's very difficult to ask that many people will stay in the news business when most of the situation is against your own interest. Just to finish, the other day, my daughter, my oldest daughter, called me in the morning, about 5 a.m. in the morning, because she was having a bad dream. She was dreaming, she had a nightmare, and she asked me to be very careful, because she was almost crying, because I was dreaming that you were killed along with your photographer. And then you have to think twice. It's not just you. It's also your relatives, the people that you love. When you see that there's so much impunity, even in the cases where the violence is not related to our work as reporters. And I do want to say that I want to comment, because even in those conditions, there's a lot of reporters that are still pursuing the truth, taking great risk. I get very angry when people says, oh, investigative journalists is dead in Mexico, because I see a lot of brave journalists risking it all and doing it in very harsh conditions. And I think I pass along over my 10 minutes. Thank you, guys. Who's next?
Thank you very much, Vicente. Well, we have Jim Gerber to follow. Very interesting. Thank you, Vicente. Please, Jim.
Yeah, thank you, Tom, and thank you, Pedro, for organizing this. And hello to everybody. And it's an honor to be on a panel with my colleagues here today. And it's been very interesting so far. I hope that I can keep that up. I'm going to talk a little bit about the border, but I'm going to not focus exclusively on the border. I want to talk in a more focused on U.S.-Mexico trade relations and some of the research I've been doing lately on this. What got me started going down this path was the rhetoric of Donald Trump and the threats to not renegotiate NAFTA, but to throw it out. Or then when the negotiations started, the rhetoric was that if we didn't get the right outcome, then he wouldn't sign it. And constantly these threats about what a bad deal it was and how awful it is, how much it hurt U.S. businesses, U.S. workers, and so forth. This is all just political rhetoric, of course, but it started me wondering, so what would happen if there was no free trade agreement? I mean, what would the outcome be? And so naturally, I began to look back at the history of U.S.-Mexico trade. And by doing that and then putting together a few other pieces, I basically concluded that if the free trade agreement were thrown out, the volume of trade between the United States and Mexico would probably not change very much at all. That we would continue to see trade flows as substantial as they are. The U.S. would continue to be Mexico's #1 trade partner, and Mexico would continue to be the #1 or #2 trade partner of the U.S. And for U.S. trade, it's always Canada, Mexico, and China in some mix in there. And they over the years, they bounce around a little bit, at least in the last 10 years, 15 years. Okay, so why do I think this? And I should say one other thing. I don't want to argue that there would be no changes. There would be changes because there would have to be adjustments, and business people wouldn't like that. There'd be cost to the adjustments and whatnot. So there'd be a lot of screaming and hollering. But again, the overall volume of trade would probably not change radically at all. Okay, So how do I come at that? Well, first, it's a historical argument. The U.S. has been Mexico's #1 trading partner since the 1870s or 80s. A little bit earlier for taking most of Mexico's exports, over half of Mexico's exports. A little bit later for supplying over half of Mexico's imports. That's a pattern that's persisted for well over 100 years. It persisted during the Porfiriato, which was a period of relatively free and open trade between the two countries, albeit with fairly high tariffs, at least in the U.S. It persisted through the revolution. It persisted in the aftermath of the revolution. It persisted through the Great Depression and World War II. It persisted in the period of import substitution industrialization in Mexico, which was this period that starts sometime in the 40s and lasts up through the 1980s, and is a very intense inward-looking period of Mexican economic history in which they were not seeking a broad set of relations, and in fact, in periods of that, they were trying to lessen their focus on the U.S., lessen their dependence on the U.S. But through all of that, into the 1980s, through the debt crisis, then into the period of NAFTA and free trade, through all of that, the U.S. was supplied over half of Mexico's imports and took over half of Mexico's exports. And Mexico, for the U.S., over this long period of time, has always been in the top 5 or 6. And in the last of our trade partners, in the last 25, 30 years, it's always been in the top 3. Okay, so there is this, regardless of what policies are in place and what kind of economic development strategies being pursued, this has been a factor. Why does this happen? It happens because of geography. It's very simple. We have more or less a similar relationship with Canada. You see the very almost same pattern of trade with Canada, and it's geography. There is a trade model that economists use called the gravity model, which is based upon Newton's idea about the attraction of celestial bodies being a function of how big are they and how far apart are they. Same model applies to the economy. How big are the markets? US is huge. Mexico is very large. I mean, it's the 13th, 14th largest economy in the world, something like that. So 2 large markets, these are like giant planets, and they're right next to each other. They're right next to each other. So this gravitational pull of our goods back and forth is just enormously powerful and through all these regimes of trade. Okay, first fact, that's the basis. But there's some other factors in play, right? There's the fact that local economic development, this is now a border story, local economic development in the border region, so thinking of border states and border cities and towns, recognize the value of cross-border economic relations for the sake of their own economic development. So we've seen, particularly in the last 30, 40 years, we've seen a lot of efforts at promoting a cross-border economic strategy on the part of chambers of commerce, on the part of business people in the border region. This shows up in things like Cali Baja in California and Baja California, or the Border Metroplex Alliance in El Paso, Juarez, as well as many other efforts. The Arizona Sonora Commission, for example, is another one based in Arizona, right? So there is that push that comes from the local level. And then the third really key factor here, which is relatively new, that began to take off in the 90s, was when technological developments in communications and transportation made it possible to outsource some of your production very easily at a much lower cost, and enabled firms on both sides of the border to take advantage of the production opportunities on the other side. So as a result of that, develop these global value chains, which have knitted together our economies even more tightly. Consequently, when a populist like, or a would-be populist, a rhetorical populist like Trump says that he's going to abrogate the agreement, not honor the agreement. You know, the business community doesn't like to hear that. You know, the U.S. car industry does not want this agreement to go away, and they have his ear. They have his ear. He knows where you know, what that means to Michigan and Illinois and other car producing states, as well as what it means to states like Texas, which is highly dependent on its trade with Mexico. So there's a lot of pushback that's sort of built into the economy at this point. All right, so for all of these reasons, I think that that if the agreement were abrogated tomorrow, the volume, there'd be a lot of headlines and lots of news and tears and whatnot, and changes would happen, but the volume of trade would not change dramatically. So this led me, then I kept trying to think of, I'll end on this note, a metaphor for what's going on. So you have you know, you've got the pro-NAFTA people, or the pro-USMCA people, and the anti-USMCA people arguing about, this is really great for the economy, no, this is horrible for the economy. And throughout the history of NAFTA, I've always thought that this is like two people in a house where there's a giant hole in the roof and it's raining like crazy, and they're arguing over who's got the proper mop to clean up the water, instead of focusing on the roof where everything's coming in. This trade is going to happen regardless. That may be comforting, it may be disturbing for some people, because it also means that political action is not going to be successful at causing it to disappear. So I'll stop there, and maybe we can go to questions or something.
Thank you very much, Professor Gerber, and thanks to all our panelists. So we have a lot of questions, so thanks everybody for the questions. So first we have a question for Alfredo and Vicente, but I think both of you could answer these two questions, so I'm going to put the two questions to you, and I think you could both answer it. So the first question, it says, driven in part by drug-related homicide levels in Mexico increased in 2008 and have not returned to previous levels. What can the Mexican government do at the municipal, state, or federal levels to reduce violent crime levels, especially in the country's border states? This is the first question. And the second question is, how do limits to press freedom in Mexico affect people in the US? So Alfredo and Vicente.
Vicente, you want to go first? You've been more in Mexico. I've been spending a lot more time on the U.S. side. I'll double up with you. I think you're on mute.
Okay. I'll try to take it. I'm not just so sure, because I've been chronicling what's going on, but it's difficult to try to put a solution. But one of the things I can say about that is we went through an improvement period here in Tijuana specifically. And precisely in 2008, when we were calling about or talking about the worst violent year in the Tijuana history. At that time, we have 840 something killings that particular year. I just checked earlier today, and so far in Tijuana, the homicide numbers that the authorities are registering is almost 1,500, for 1,475. 120 of those just in the last, so far in September. So we are way worse in that sense. But I'm not pro Felipe Calderon. I'm not pro torture or pro abuses of the role or the role of the military and public safety issues. But something that is clear for us, that we've been dealing with the drug-related violence way before it became a huge problem in other states of the country. We saw an increase during that time. We were the first to denounce the changes or the militarization of the police agencies in Tijuana. But we have to admit that afterwards, they began in 2008 with the big changes and the big anti-corruption crusade with a lot of abuses from civil and military authorities. But they were able to manage a decrease on the level of impunity. I think after that, the number of drugs going through Tijuana towards San Diego increased, but the violence related to drug trafficking decreased significantly. I think something like that happened also in Juarez, which coincidentally had the same, at that time, the same chief of police, who was Julian Leizaola here in Tijuana from 2008 until I think it's 11. And after that, he went to Ciudad Juarez. He has been accused of torture, as many others of the key players on the government side of those years. But they were able to manage. I'm not condoning abuses of human rights. It's not at all. But I think we need to be very careful, because we cannot be trying to fix a gang-grade arm with aspirin. And I think we are being very cautious about the side effects of what we are doing. I remember in a panel a long time ago where Alfredo was in one of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists with a guy from newspaper, the El Mañana newspaper at that time. At that time, AMLO was running for president. And I was surprised when, as an audience member, I hear one of these guys saying, I want them to do something. If AMLO will make any pact with drug traffickers, maybe that's good, because they were affected really, really bad. They pay a very high price, and my hat goes off to them. But now I understand why they were so willing to take those risks. So the authorities can do something. I don't think they're gonna finish with drug trafficking, but they are able, if they get organized, to reduce, just as is happening in the U.S., which is still dealing with a lot of drug trafficking, but don't have the same level of violence that we are seeing in Tijuana and other areas.
Pedro, if I can just add, I mean, I'll make it quick. I think that I've been covering the drug war in Mexico since the late 90s, and one of the things that always strikes me is there's no continuous plan. Every 3 years, every 6 years, there's a whole new plan. You have to start all over again. You train people and then you fire them. And obviously the whole corruption part of it continues. I think the United States obviously has to do a lot more to control its demand. I mean, one funny anecdote that I saw just a few months ago, when there was so much talk about the lack of toilet paper on the U.S. side. I mean, you had some of these smugglers who couldn't cross drugs. Suddenly, I mean, there was a surge of toilet paper coming to the U.S. side, coming to El Paso, and I mean, so demand, obviously a continuous plan on the part of Mexico. I think that would show a lot more commitment. Whether, you know, whatever plan it is, but you got to stick to something and not keep changing everything based on ideology. And the second part, very important question on the press. I mean, having been back in the U.S. for a while, I see just the lack of information we're increasingly getting from Mexico, because there are more zones of silence across Mexico, and which means much, much more control at the local levels in communities that we never imagined would be silent. For example, El Bajío. And just to pay tribute to a colleague who died this week, Julian Cardona was a longtime journalist since the early 1990s. On Tuesday, he passed away. I mean, that losing Julian, for a lot of journalists, for a lot of readers all over the world, means a lot less understanding of Mexico and on the border.
Thank you. Thank you too very much. Boy, your comments, both of your comments, want me to ask follow-up questions. I can't right now, but I need to shift to some of our other panelists, but maybe you can put this on the back burner. I'm wondering how the attacks on free press in the U.S. have impacted Mexico. But let me turn to Dr. Bojorquez now. We had one of our attendees wanting to ask you if you could speculate on how COVID has affected the flow of Mexicans to the U.S. For healthcare, and especially Mexican and Mexican Americans who are trying to find ways to cross their elderly parents to the U.S. They feel more vulnerable in Tijuana, or they're just seeking a higher level of care. How COVID has, if any of your research can shed light on those questions.
Well, I have no like very specific information on that sort of cases. But for what I've been doing with in collaborations with our other colleagues that are working in healthcare, mainly in Tijuana and Mexicali, what they saw at the height of the transmission of COVID in maybe March till May or beginning of June was that as the Mexican side hospitals were becoming more stranded by the numbers of patients, of COVID patients they were seeing, many other conditions were left untreated. So people who usually would go to those hospitals was looking for other sorts of care or other places to look for care, and crossing to the US was one possibility in that sense. And specifically for COVID, yeah, there were cases of people being afraid of not receiving good care in Mexico, so preferring to go across the border. Of course, this happens for a minority of people. No, I mean, they have to be persons who have access to healthcare insurance in the US and who can go across the border because they have the papers to do so. No, so it's not so much a matter of undocumented crossings. But yeah, that happened, and it was noticed in the health services. Yeah.
Okay, so yes, thank you, Yetza. So we also have some question for Professor Gerber. The first one says, how did the U.S.-China trade war affect the border states of Mexico and the U.S.? That would be the first one. And the second one is not specified towards whom it's directed, but I think, Professor, you could answer it. It's from a master's student at COLEF. And he says, from the US side perspective, what are the main steps to follow in order to increase the cooperation between the US and Mexico, not just in the commercial perspective, but in a scientific research and education aspect as well?
Okay, yeah, so the trade war with China has caused everybody to rethink their production chains, their value chains. So if you're outsourcing some parts of your production to China, suddenly it becomes a bit risky to rely on, just-in-time deliveries, or even the possibility of bringing in those goods at the prices that you anticipated. This is forcing producers to move, and there appears to be a big wave of producers moving, particularly into Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, for example, has been a host country that's received a lot of investment that's leaving China. It's reported, although I haven't seen data on this, but it's reported that, and Pedro, you may know about this, it's reported that there are quite a few firms that have relocated to Mexico. They may have left Mexico in the early 2000s when China entered the WTO, and now they're deciding that it's best to be back in Mexico. I think, oddly enough, probably on balance, the U.S. trade war with China, which I don't see as a good thing, but it may turn out to be a good thing for Mexico and Maquila and border communities. That's a possibility. I don't know if that's the case. What can we do to increase cross-border cooperation and research and teaching? This is an issue that's affected me quite a bit because of my career at San Diego State. We had dual degree programs at San Diego State in a couple of fields with UABC and with CETIS and with the Guadalajara campus of ITESM, Monterrey Tech. And those were canceled more or less because of the rise of violence. And the institutions on the U.S. side became extremely nervous about sending students or even allowing faculty to travel if it was on some research related type of faculty travel. So that a lot of that it really got scaled back. And this, I agree with Vicente in this area. This is this is just one area, one small area in which the cross-border relations have become more difficult. And it's harder to pursue. But I think also that, we're able to put this meeting together and do it virtually. So it's not always the case that you have to travel in order to cooperate in research. I've written papers with people where we've never sat down together, for example, other than virtually. So that can go on. I think that you also need individual champions. You need people that want to take it upon themselves and want to make it happen, so to speak. Because if you wait for administrators to do it, it just isn't going to happen. Their plates are full. They've got too much going on, and it's there's not a lot of rewards for them in it. But I think this is something we really need to think about. We need in particular to think about how do we get more students going back and forth. We need to increase the volume of students flowing in both directions dramatically. And I keep looking at the the Erasmus program or Erasmus Plus program in Europe as a kind of a model to try to promote that. But I hopefully there've been a lot of bad periods in the border's history. This is one of them. They don't last forever. I think the natural tendency is for border communities to get along pretty well. And hopefully we'll go back to that. The problem obviously is mostly at the national level. It's not at the local community level as much. So we'll see. Pedro, can I ask a question?
By all means,
Yes, of course.
you can ask a question.
Yeah,
And we encourage all of you, if you have a question of each other, please just jump in without asking our permission.
Okay, so this is for Vicente and Alfredo, whoever wants to answer, both of you. I'd like your opinions. I was listening to a blog by a woman reporter in Mexico City, and she made the claim that actually it's more dangerous to report on government corruption than it is to report on narco activities. And she was dead serious, in making that claim. And she herself had been, pursued by Mexican security forces for reporting she was doing. Is that accurate? I mean, are they in the ballpark? I mean, probably there are no numbers, but just, in general, is that something like the case?
120% accurate.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen how it's virtually the same thing when you're talking about government and drug organizations. It's one and the same thing. Narcos they love foreign correspondents who can write these mythical stories about them, how the narco came and saved their town and gave them water and put the electricity. They love to be the Robin Hood. They want to go to the graves in Sinaloa and people are playing and singing. But when you start connecting the dots as to how that person got to that level, follow the money, that's when the troubles begin. I had a very personal situation where I was following the Zetas. One time were the most dangerous group in Tamaulipas. Their headquarters in the United States was Dallas, Texas. And it was fun. I mean, I learned two things: was how sophisticated they operate. I mean, they actually had a person whose job was really to monitor the media, almost like a spokesperson who was checking regularly who's covering what, who's doing what. And everything seemed to be fine until the reporting took me to how did the Mexican government end up doing a deal, not just with the Zetas, but with the Gulf cartel, with the Sinaloa cartel, with the Juarez cartel. Who was at that meeting? Members of the military. Who was representing the president of Mexico? And suddenly the death threats began. And you know, obviously, my situation really pales in comparison. I mean, I'm Mexican. I was born in Mexico, but I have a U.S. passport. And I think that, and sort of teeing off to Tom's question, I mean, that kind of helped save me, if you will, or gave me protection. That's not the case today. I mean, I think for years, colleagues like Vicente and I, and many others, you know, looked to the United States as an example, as a beacon for how to live in a free democratic society, how to hold the government accountable, etc. That's not the case anymore. I don't know that I would take the same risk that I took years ago. And like Vicente, I mean, I agree with Vicente. There are a lot of very courageous journalists in Mexico, and in very difficult times, in pandemic or no pandemic, violence or no violence. I mean, journalism in Mexico, and independent journalism, is at a new level. I mean, it's very, very sophisticated. But I wonder, as an American journalist, whether I would take the risk. I mean, my situation was, I thought, you know, if the U.S. government is telling the Mexican government, all the cartels, which happened. I mean, when I received the death threat, the U.S. Embassy actually put out a statement and say, "Thou shalt not harm an American." I don't know that would happen today, and that's something that I think gives a lot of foreign correspondents. I speak for myself. I think that would give me pause.
If I may, I think it's because we are just older, Alfredo, and that's why we think twice about those issues, or more wisely about us. I think that the main problem is to really make a difference between one and the other one. I mean, when the public officer or the public servant becomes member of the drug cartel, and this is the main problem. It's difficult to spot them. I will feel more threatened by just naming directly or going against somebody that I think is just a criminal, because I see that there's have no concerns about bringing attention or calling on the corruption, because the public official will rely on his connections within the government to do their own part on this drug trafficking organization. But that doesn't say that one could be more dangerous, or in my perspective, it's difficult to see the difference between there. And also, on the other hand, I want to say this very respectfully, because I've been following Alfredo way before I met him personally, and I commend him the way he conducts as a reporter when he was covering Mexico, and how he was very adamant to talk about the value of the local reporter in Mexico, which in many cases are the sources or the main way that the foreign correspondent will get the information to put it in perspective. So just going back to the other question, what are you, the U.S. audience, missing when you see these threats to the press of freedom? You are losing depth. You are losing the more boots on the ground, so to speak, perspective of what's going on. And as you have desert zones for local news in the U.S. due to the collapse of the model of all model newspapers, you have it way before here due to the violence. And you have to be very careful, because then one of the problems that I have with foreign correspondents, not just Americans, from foreign correspondents from everywhere, is that they like to play the action hero card. And in many cases, because this will be the closest thing that you will do as a a war correspondent. And they used to hide a lot of the coverage. There's a lot of dangers here. And I think Alfredo is right when he says that the conditions are not the same now, because with the creation of baby cartels, as they used to call it in Colombia, the guy who is dealing with drugs for a higher lieutenant doesn't have the same perspective that not to bring a lot of attention to the situation. So in that matter, they just want to be more brutal. So scare their competitors. And that makes it more worrisome, I think.
You were very respectful, Vicente.
I'm sure it's not your case. No. I'm not trying to blame anybody, but I want to see, I really believe that we need to keep that in perspective, because otherwise we are selling this literary image of what's going on, and we are missing where the real needs are. For example, we need to invest in local reporting, and we haven't seen that in all areas, not just because to deal with the pandemic, for example, we are dealing with more restriction of access to information, because, for example, the governments are taking advantage of the economic crisis of the media and capturing, as the UNESCO calls it, the manage of the media enterprises to try to control the flow of information.
Tom, can I ask a question?
Please.
Yes. Professor
Please.
Gerber, Professor Gerber, I'm very curious. If the trade agreement would end tomorrow, who would lose more, the United States or Mexico?
Well, as I tried to indicate, I don't think it would really end, that it would we'd go back to our tariffs that we have with the rest of the world, and they're pretty low. But I think that that's a good question. I don't really think I can answer it with any kind of substance, but my instinct tells me that there would be a lot of damage to some U.S. businesses, particularly the car industry might get hurt quite a bit because of the way in which it's spread across Canada, the U.S., and Mexico. And it really depends upon those plants, parts manufacturers in Mexico, which is a big part of what Mexico does, is parts manufacturing as well as assembly of final automobiles. But I think about 80% of the employment's parts manufacturers. That would be harmful to them, to the U.S. businesses.
Talk about the supply chain.
Yeah, as the supply chain gets broken up, then you got to think about, okay, what else am I going to do? Is it still cost effective, even if I have to pay, tariffs to bring in these parts from Mexico? Now I no longer have free trade. I'm going to have to pay a tariff. But it's interesting, because when the USMCA went into effect, and it has some more stringent conditions on what constitutes a North American product for purposes of free trade in the car industry. And there was a lot of speculation that some manufacturers in Mexico that sell to firms in the US or affiliate of a firm in the US might simply avoid those restrictions and just say, well, we'll forget about free trade. We'll just pay the tariff to get our product into the US, because the tariff on car parts is about 2.5%. And this is what you find throughout, particularly in the US. Tariffs are really low in general. There are some products where that's not the case, but in general, they average like 2.8% or something like that. And about half the items that come into the US come in with a 0% tariff. The agreement, then you wonder, well, so why do we need an agreement? I mean, I think it was important in the way that it sort of put Mexico on the map of U.S. business, created awareness. You see this particularly, I think, in Texas, where it really created a strong awareness. Mexico is not a liability, it's an asset, and we need to utilize it more.
Thank you.
Yeah. I have a question for Ietza. Yeah, years ago, I wrote a paper about Americans that migrate to Mexico and some of the issues involved with that. And one of the issues that came up was that in particular places, and Los Cabos is cited as a place where this is true, it put a lot of pressure on the medical systems there. That it sort of suddenly doctors and nurses and clinics and other facilities were less available for Mexican citizens because Americans were able to pay a little bit more, and they, doctors would rather charge a little bit higher fees and cater to an American crowd, I guess. And so it was kind of sucking up the resources that were available to the rest of Mexico. Is that a problem in the border region? Do you see that as an issue?
Well, we don't have really studies of the consequences in economic and in health services terms of this phenomena. But internationally, what is known about health tourism is that it does make services more expensive for the locals because everything goes up, the tariffs goes up. And it also tends to bring this sort of situation where the best doctors and nurses prefer to work in private clinics and hospitals catering to the foreign patients. So it has the potential of being a problem in that sense, but at the same time, it's a huge source of economic development in the area, no? So I don't know really. It will need an economist to try to get how the balance is right now. No?
Yeah. Interesting. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. We have another question for Yetza. It says, what reform would improve health outcomes the fastest along the border, particularly on the Mexican side?
What reform? Universal health coverage. How to get to universal health coverage? That's the question. Yeah, because I mean, for most of the population in Mexico, the Mexican population and the migrants coming mainly from the southern border, I mean, from other regions in Central America, Latin America, etc. The main source of care should be the public health sector, not the private health care sector. No? So it's a very different type of system and services that are required for this kind of population as compared to the minority who are able to pay for services and the ones we were talking about just now. No? So yeah, I think universal health coverage will be the issue.
I have one more follow-up for you. With respect to both the expulsion of migrants from the U.S. to Mexico and also the way in which the border has been kind of closed to Central American migrants. And so they've settled, to the degree that they've settled along the border, can you describe the kinds of pressures that's put on public health along the border over the last couple of years?
Okay, I wish it were putting pressure because that will mean that the health system in Mexico is responding as it should to this situation. But it actually isn't, that's the truth. I mean, it's a very, there are different situations in different points and cities along the border. There are some jurisdictions, it's been solved in the local level mainly, and there are some jurisdictions that are doing a very good job of taking care of migrants. They are trying to send doctors and try to provide care, but there are others that have no resources in order to do that. There is no a committed budget to take care of the migrants' health care needs. So there's no really a place in the Mexican public health system for this type of situation. So, I mean, there should be a pressure, but.
Okay. Wow. Well, we have just a couple of minutes left. If any of you would like to have a final word or two, we should wrap it up in the next 5 minutes, but we would like to give you the final word this afternoon. So please.
I'm putting on my journalist cap again, and I have just a follow-up question to Professor Gerber. You said the border, somehow they get along. This is just another bad moment. Remind us of another bad moment as bad as this one, and how did we get through that?
Yeah.
I mean, what have we learned?
Yeah, okay. Well, you know, the mass deportations of the 1930s, the mass deportation of 1954, 1969, Nixon closes the border because Mexico wouldn't collaborate in stopping the flow of marijuana into the U.S. So he closed the border for a couple of weeks and then opened it, but only partially for a couple of weeks. And then he declared victory. And as I like to say, there's never been marijuana in the U.S. since then. And you know, so there've been these other periods. We've seen. I was really interested in what you were saying about the impact on El Paso of the lack of border crossing. That's happened before. There's a number of periods in the 1970s. It was usually when the peso collapsed, and there were some really strong devaluations in the 1970s and the 1980s, and then again in 94, 95, where border cities on the U.S. side suffered enormously because of that. So I don't know. This is perhaps the worst, I think, you know, because it's coming from the top. And it's seems to be organized in a way, but I don't know what's going to happen, but I just have this sense that there's a lot of interest on both sides of the border of having a border region which is prosperous and peaceful, and that people continually look to do that. I'm also, if I'm rambling too much, stop me, Tom, but I'm also reminded though of the fact that, you know, if you ask a question like, you know, with what country in the world does the U.S. have the most bilateral treaties? You know, it's Canada with something like 230 or so. Number two, Mexico with 220. And we talk about a special relationship with Great Britain, but Great Britain's way down there in terms of the number of bilateral treaties we have. So there's so many things around which we, whether we want to or not, we have to cooperate. You know, if you don't have ground-to-air agreements, then airplanes fall out of the sky when you have airports so close to each other as Rodriguez Field and Lindbergh Field. You know, so you need international agreements on those things, and this is an area where it's behind the scenes. We don't see it. You know, the other one last thing, and I'll shut up. But you know, a lot of the problem right now is the pandemic. You know, it's also Trump, and it's also the racist, xenophobic, you know, Nazis that he's got in charge of U.S. Border policy and migration policy. But a lot of the problem is made much worse by the pandemic. And that we're all hoping will, you know, may take another year or so, but at some point it will be over.
Thank you, Jim. I think we'll let Vicente, who seems like you want to say something. Why don't we give you the last word? But before you do, I just want to thank all of you, all four of you, and as well as my fabulous co-host, Pedro, for a really terrific hour and a half. And I look forward to seeing you all in person and dealing with my thirst in a more tangible way. All right. Thank you, Vicente.
I will try to be very quickly. I'm just very worried about that perspective from Jim, in the sense that the changes are not moving us. I think they're moving us in a different direction, at least in Tijuana. I'm talking about Tijuana because this is the border, the area of the border that I really understand, because we have seen a huge change. Tijuana is now a lot more like any other city in Mexico. We have been losing the advantages that we used to have at the beginning when we were so far away from central government of Mexico and closer to the U.S. I understand that many of those changes were due because Mexico was trying to reclaim, so to speak, their territory here at the border. Until 1976, we used to be more common using dollars than pesos, or still we're more linked to the economy of the other side of the border. But now, right now, I really think that one example, for example, the footprint, so to speak, of the Mexican government is making life more difficult for the people in Tijuana. One example, los carros chocolate, the illegal vehicles imported from the U.S., where the second-hand vehicle that will represent a big step ahead on the conditions of living for many migrants from Mexico or other places to Tijuana, was a big increase. Now we have a big problem of legality with those. We have a lot of problems with the violence because they are still taking decisions 30,000 kilometers away from here. And we have less participation of the voters in local elections. We need to rethink how we are going to be relating us, the journalists, and academia, because I think we need to share more the battle of corruption that is at the source of most of all the problems in Mexico. So I thank you for the invitation. Thank you for the opportunity to meet you guys and to say hi again to Alfredo, which I admire a lot. But I hope this will give us the chance to rethink the relationship that we have between the academia and the journalists locally in both sides of the border. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you, everybody. Yeah.
Thank you, Pedro.
Thank you.
Jim.
Yeah, thank you.
Yatsa.
Yes.
Saludos.
Thank you.
Right.
It's really, really great. Thank you so much. And Vicente, you win for the most impressive background. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.